Thomas, coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today our question comes to us from SkepticPsychologist, or rather, our series of questions related to evolution and the soul. And because this is a series of questions closely related to one another, dealing with a very complex subject, I want to start by saying that I do not remotely guarantee that I'm going to touch on every aspect of these answers. I'm going to give general answers, which I think are suitable to the vlog format. The kind of questions we're going to be talking about are things that in Correllian teaching you generally would not encounter in many cases until certainly second and often third degree, or even only if you were to pursue world walker training. It's not that no one else can know these, but that's where you would receive the instruction for them. And this is because they are considered higher teachings and they are more complicated than certain other questions might be, and therefore the answer will also be more complicated. This is rather like the subject of giving an oracle. In the Correllian tradition, anyone can learn to give an oracle, but a third degree must learn to give an oracle. Oracles are expected of third degrees, even if only once. But it's not required for anyone else, but that doesn't mean others can't also learn it. And this is kind of like that. You would receive instruction at those levels. It doesn't mean you can't study it at other levels. So, having said that, these are the questions. The first question is, what is the Correllian position on biological evolution? And we've talked about that here at the vlog on a number of occasions, and I will go back over it. We believe very much in biological evolution, and we believe that is the tool of creation. So we are creationists, but also evolutionists, and we see no particular conflict in these points of view. We believe that evolution is how creation unfolds. And we would agree with the idea that every living creature on the earth is descended from common ancestors, ultimately a common ancestor. And we believe that this is how spirit has chosen to express itself in the material world. And we believe that evolution has a guidance from spirit and also from ourselves. We believe that while one is not conscious of it, particularly various forms of life which are less intellectual than humans, but even humans, we believe that though we have not the consciousness of it, we nonetheless are shaping our evolution at a spiritual level, and that this is just as true for amoebas and dogs and cats and fruit bats and what have you, that their soul level is actively involved in their physical evolution. But that physical evolution is very much the tool by which the goals of spirit are expressed in the flesh. So again, we are creationists and evolutionists at the same time and do not see these things as being in conflict. And I will also point out that in the 19th century, when evolution was being brought on the scene in the modern world, the people who brought it forward came in two kinds: theistic evolutionists and atheistic evolutionists. And of course, the latter became the dominant point of view, but theistic evolution is not at all a new concept. So that's our first question. The second question is, do all living things experience an afterlife? And I do have these written down, because there are so many of them. Do all living things experience an afterlife? We would say yes. We would say that the nature of that afterlife depends in part on the nature of the physical life, and how much of the soul was invested in that life, how much consciousness that life had or did not have, how much growth that life had or did not have. But we would say that in theory, all living things, as well as things that in the ordinary world might not be considered living things, have an afterlife, and a part of them is always there. But obviously, if they were merely reactive in their physical existence, then there's not going to be much of them there, because there wasn't really that much of them here. and those that were more complex will have a more complex afterlife. And in keeping with the subject we just spoke to, the idea of creationism and evolution as things that are working together, we also believe in afterlife and reincarnation, but that hinges in part on questions that are going to be coming up in this series. So, if only things of a certain intelligence or level of consciousness survive, what about the others? Well, we kind of just answered that. And I would say that the survival in the afterlife has to do with how much there actually was of the life. But it's important to remember also that what manifested in this world was not all there was. We all have a higher self, human and non-human alike. And those higher selves are more complex and more evolved than what is shown in the physical world. So just because not much happened in that physical life, say for example, well, let's consider my sister. She died when she was 4 years old. There's not a lot of life there. But that does not mean her soul is not as complex as any other. In fact, there is a teaching that in the afterlife, souls tend to express themselves in a mature manner regardless of the age at which they died, and is often perceived as being around 33 years of age. But of course age is irrelevant to the soul, but in terms of what people will perceive, that is often what has been described as being perceived. That just because one is very old at the time of their death does not mean that they're very old in their afterlife. Just because someone was very young at the time of their death does not mean they're very young in their afterlife. And because it is the higher self that actually survives, negative traits also tend not to survive in that afterlife. And there's a saying that I've often heard that if drunk Uncle Harry was drunk Uncle Harry in life, he is going to be drunk Uncle Harry in death as an ancestor. But this is not in fact what people experience who work with ancestors. Drunk Uncle Harry will have put down those negative aspects in transitioning into the higher self. And what you will experience in working with drunk Uncle Harry as an ancestor is the better self that Uncle Harry could have been. So continuing, the last question is the soul evolved or bestowed? And again, the answer for us would be both. We would say that the souls were created through the medium of the monads from deity, that deity broke off the souls from itself, and therefore all souls ultimately are deity, but through a kind of chain, for want of a better way to put it, that goes from deity to the monad to the soul to the life, and then to the event. And that this chain is a very important part of understanding what you're dealing with, and at each step in that chain, there are numerous splits. For example, in one lifetime, there are many, many events. In one soul, there are many, many lifetimes. And in one monad, there are many, many souls. And in deity, there are many monads. Specifically, we teach 9. Now, the soul initially is bestowed by deity, if you want to put it that way, that comes from deity and is never truly separate from deity. But as it goes forward and it experiences, it in effect splits, kind of like a tree branch. So that monad evolves into many souls. Those souls evolve into many lifetimes. And these are not necessarily new beginnings, these are branches. And we hold that the soul continues to branch out the longer it exists. And this happens in one of 2 ways. In the first instance, we hold that the soul can have many different lifetimes coexisting at the same time in the physical world. Part of the reason for this is that time is different for the soul. Part of the reason is that the soul is much more complex than the physical lifetime, than the physical consciousness. And as the soul does this, those many different lifetimes coexisting at once do not all go back together. As they go forward, they become separate streams of incarnation. They split, they branch. And where the soul had 1 life, it may then have 5, it may then have 15, as these branch through subsequent incarnations. And when you do past life work and you go back up that branch, you go up your particular branch. But the farther you go, the more of these different lifetimes connect. And as I said, this is complex higher teaching, but this is what we teach. Now, the second way that this occurs is that we believe that there are many different probabilities, that we live in a multiverse, not a universe, and that there are many different variations on this world that we are living in. And that when a lifetime comes to a major choice, often all different variations on that choice are made in different probabilities. And therefore, the life also branches. So there's not just one version of any given life necessarily. There can be several different versions. There could be many versions depending on what was set to be learned in that life. And what began as a single stream of the soul going into that life, by the time the life is ended, could be many. And these two don't come back together. They go forward as separate streams of the soul, and in the different probabilities in which they have been lived. So, in third degree, I talk about how when I was first taught these things, I had difficulty understanding them. I could not wrap my mind around them. Probably did not help that I was quite young, but I think that the higher teachings are hard to wrap your mind around. And I was very fortunate to have as my teacher Lady Crystal, my principal teacher, and her enlightened attitude was, okay, we'll come back to this later. And she waited 6 months before she came back to it. And amazingly, all of those concepts I had trouble grasping were much clearer after 6 months, even though I had not come back to them in my mind. I had not thought about them, I had not worked on them, but my consciousness had expanded and they were no longer mind-boggling to me. So what I advise people when they're studying these things is that if at first it doesn't make a lot of sense to you, take some time away from it. Come back to it and look at it again. Now, I do always tell people to trust only what makes sense to them, but when you're in a situation where you've already seen many things that are true and effective, it can be good to take a little while and let certain things sink in. The idea of multiverses and probabilities is particularly difficult if you have not worked with the nature of reality. And, I've talked on the vlog before about how some people love to stress all the dangers of metaphysics, most of which I don't think are particularly dangerous. But what is dangerous is the possibility of losing your place in the reality that you are in by studying the illusory nature of reality itself. You have to be very grounded and have a strong sense of self to work with these things, and this is why. But nonetheless, we have discussed these subjects, which, as I say, are considered higher teachings. We have not touched on every aspect of them. We have not certainly gone into them in any kind of exhaustive way. But we have touched on them in a way that is appropriate to the vlog. So I hope you found it interesting, and until next time, may you blessed be. Please join me for our Corellian peace prayer. I pray for peace. I pray for love. I pray for stability. I pray for the nation where I live. I pray for the world.